Hello again. This is Judas Lightforge, continuing the story of the Contractors. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy. We each file outside. Some seem to have grim purpose, others almost aloof about the predicament. Being under contract to this hag is worse than they realize. Being under the thumb of such a being is never ending. Whatever they want from you will always lead into more favors, more depths, more bullshit. Though wincing in the light of the two suns blazing in the sky, I could see almost no one outside. No one working or moving about, only a few guards. Then Griswold roared, lifting his axe and burying it into the ground. Then again. His constant grunting agitating the beginnings of an alcohol-fueled headache. So of course I asked, "Griswold, what are you doing?" Without stopping, he just mumbled, "Hag lady said cultist underground." How do you argue with that? Great idea, Griswold. Let us know when you get to them. What am I going to do? Argue with that logic? All I could really do is sit down on the edge of a well nearby and come down from this drunk. I could see Noctis move from behind me, off to the other side of the well. Seeing him in the light, I could take in what he really was. A schooled wizard, though he didn't look too old. I'm pretty sure I'm older. Dark flowing robes, a hood, and strange white hair drifting over a clean-shaven face. He started moving his hands in what I vaguely recognized as a spell. I simply didn't care enough to keep watching to find out what it was. Mercifully, Griswold had stopped digging, sparing me the headache that I feared. I couldn't see him, so I assumed he went back into the bar. You would think the others would have followed me out. They obviously don't understand what we all had just stepped in. Maybe it's best if I ditch them. There is safety in numbers, but these numbers were just as well as enemies. I turned back to Noctis just in time to see a colorful pseudo-dragon emerge from the well, no larger than a bird of prey. The creature dropped 2 shining stones from its claws into Noctis's hand, then came to rest on his shoulder. Maybe that one could be of some use. "Judas is paying!" I hear Griswold's voice boom. My feet immediately started carrying me into Dirk's tavern. Stumbling still yet from the drinks, but staying upright. I opened the door to see the orc barmaid was looking at me with her hand out. She informs me that I owe 8 gold. Then I advised her that from now on, I only pay for me. Luckily, there was still enough coin in my pocket to cover the bill. The whole time, Griswold watched me with a smile on his face. Catching my eye, he held up a rock, gestured it toward me, and demanded, "You pet rock." Without thinking, it just came out. I said, "Fuck you." A flash of anger crossed his face and he threw the rock at me. I tried to move out of the way, but the drink had slowed me down. A paw pushed my shoulder, knocking me out of the way into the floor. The rock shattered and released a foul odor. That was no rock. It was dung. I had enough of this guy. I held my hand out toward him and on instinct reached inside myself for the desire to maim, desire to destroy, desire to hear screams for mercy. But nothing happened. I wasn't sure what was supposed to happen, but I knew this is how I harmed people. Then a paw grabbed my hand and helped me to my feet. It was Seiji. He had both pushed me out of the way and helped me get back up. Then our charming, orcish barmaid Lilith angrily slammed her fist onto her counter and demanded that we all get out. I again marched outside, but this time with no intention of stopping. Then a hand grabbed my arm and pulled me. I am done with this foolishness. I turn around and swing my fist only to see a shadow move around me. I turned again with my fist up to take another strike, and in front of me was the tiny Lady V with a smile on her face. Frustrated, I took a step to get around her, and she again stepped in front of me. The door of the tavern creaked as the others stepped out. Griswold droning on about a cookie, trying to convince others to eat it. I took just a short glance to see it was the same kind of rock he had thrown at me. V spoke to me, but loud enough for the others to hear. She said she has a wagon with other people who need to make it to Bayor. There is enough room for all of us to travel together, and the hag had also said that the cultists operate in Bayor. Maybe we could kill two birds with one stone.
No, they're under the dirt,
Griswold objected. Ignoring the intellectual titan, I had to take a moment to consider V's words. As much as I hate to admit it, her idea was better than walking until I happened to find them. Seiji walked up beside me and nodded, agreeing to travel with V. I simply nodded to indicate the same. I looked around to see the others agree in their own various ways. V then advised that we should get out of town before discussing anything further. Again, everyone agreed and began to follow her towards the gate. I lingered for just a moment to let them get ahead of me, and then I heard it. A low growl in my head. Do not trust them. Then the rumbling faded. I felt the cold of death creep down my arm, followed by the crackle of eldritch power in my hand. I looked to see dark power slithering over my arm. Then it faded. I didn't know what it was, but it was familiar. This was the power I attempted to summon earlier. This was the power I felt when I wanted to hurt people. Despite the warning, I decided to catch up to the others. The guard stopped me just long enough to say that no one is allowed back in at night. I simply nodded and walked through. The red and brown leaves floated to the ground, falling from impossibly tall trees. While the trees were preparing for winter, there was still a canopy ahead, giving shade to the path. It didn't take long before I caught up to the others. V was already speaking of her plans. She believed that there were 3 cultists in the bar. She could tell because they were speaking abyssal to each other, which is an uncommon language to say the least. Seiji quickly suggested that we go back and capture them. Problem was, one of them was a leader. Him going missing would draw more attention than we could deal with. Also, there was an older man at Dirk's who was not drinking, but keeping an eye on everyone. He stepped out of the tavern shortly after we did, and is probably following. We decided to leave the main trail and follow a footpath into the woods. After a bit more walking, the others start looking around as if they're on alert. I hear the crunching of leaves behind us, and not far. I stepped up to Seiji between myself and the source of the sound. V had stopped speaking and completely vanished. We picked up our pace until we reached a clearing. Noctis turned into a blur and moved behind a tree. Then I heard a subtle chime from above us. Looking up, I could see birdhouses, but far too high for humans to put up. This forest could belong to the Fae. And that's all we need. More tricksters. Then there was the heavy clack of metal, and an arrow flew through the air and stuck in Seiji's shoulder, piercing through his thick green armor. We looked in the direction that the projectile had come from, and could see a man in a dark hood holding a heavy crossbow. I don't know a lot about those weapons, but it was big, and apparently could put a hole in steel. The figure began to load another bolt, but then suddenly stopped. As he started to fall, I only caught a hint of a figure move behind him and then disappear. I heard the crunching of leaves and could see another hooded figure begin to run towards the body, his hand outstretched towards his comrade. We all charged forward towards him. The dead body began to visibly decompose and then burst into flames. Whatever they're doing out here, they're trying to hide it. Noctis stepped out from behind his tree, and a globule launched from his hand. It hit the ground in front of the cultist, with a splash. He stumbled over it, seeming to slip and slide, but stayed on his feet. With a curse, our foe turned from us, and began to run away. Seiji ran ahead of me, and I managed to keep pace, but then suddenly with a burst, he was way ahead of me, catching up to the assailant. He drew his large sword and swung it downwards. The blade found its mark. Blood sprayed from the man's back, and lightning streaked across the weapon. Griswold bellowed from behind us,
No kill!
But there's no time to consider the orders of our would-be master tactician. I kept running, and I knew I had a spell that fires directly ahead of me. Maybe now that I can summon that dark energy, I will be able to use it. Seiji was still in the way, but possibly I can aim it well enough not to hit him. I reached out my hand, trying to draw on that power again, but the anger, or rage, that dark place was locked off from me. I felt a warm hand on my back, and again, a sweet voice in my ear. Use my gifts, my love. I felt safe, like I was in control. My hand, still outstretched in front of me, suddenly reached to the sky. I could feel the light wrap around my arm. Then, with a flash, the cultist was engulfed in the glow of fire, but nothing burned. The spell was only harming him. And then I understood. Chelsandra understood what I needed to do, and she gave me a tool to do it without hurting the others. But this was not satisfying. I wanted more. How dare this worthless growth try to attack me? This filth, this wretch, this upstart blight on existence. I clenched my fist and pulled it down. Light streaked from the heavens, striking my enemy's crown. With a flash, his head was gone in a burst of blood and white matter. The body ran another step before crumbling to the ground, and I stood there with grim satisfaction that I didn't understand. The only thing that drew me out of my stupor was Griswold snarling as he walked by me. He shot me a very angry glance. He asked me why I didn't want to work together. What he means is, why don't I want to do as told? He began to rage at me about how we need people alive to take back. As he was yelling, I just walked away. The guy plays with shit and throws it at people. I'm not concerned about his words of wisdom. Besides, Seiji had an arrow in him. Maybe I could get it out. When I got to him, he was holding his arm, but didn't seem to want to trouble anybody. Seiji, let's get that arrow out of you. He nodded in appreciation. Before looking at the arrow, I peeked at the headless body. Strangely, it was frozen. While I had never cast that spell before, ice was definitely not part of it. I turned my attention to the arrow and could tell it was deep and painful. I was conflicted about it. I felt nothing when I stood behind Seiji to protect myself, but seeing him bleeding like this, I thought I should feel guilty. I didn't, but the thought was there, like I had done something wrong. But it wasn't wrong. It saved me from an arrow. Well, that aside, I had no idea how I was going to get this arrow out of him. Nesta moved her hand past mine and grabbed the arrow. She gave me a knowing glance, indicating that she knew what she was doing. Her hand waved over the wound, a green mist flowing into it as she slowly drew the arrow. I turned away to keep my eye on the others. They were still obsessing over the frozen body. V was again speaking. She was talking of camping here for the night, as one sun had already gone down, and the other was dipping into the horizon. Before long, they were gathering wood to build a campfire. Absently, I said aloud, "At least we got rid of the threats around here." Nesta whispered from behind me that she wasn't so sure. She had finished removing the arrow, and Seiji had at least stopped bleeding. The armor would still need repairs, though. V said she had to get back to get her people. Before anyone could say anything, she again vanished. Now, while I am not a student of magic, I understood it well enough that what she was doing wasn't magical. She was just that quick. So, I simply decided to help the others gather some of the wood. Then whenever it seemed like they were finished, I sat down beside it to rest my head. I reached out my finger and touched one of the twigs in the pile. With a few words, it caught fire. I remembered this spell, prestidigitation. Quite a mouthful to say, but the words I spoke were in Celestial. I knew the language, but I haven't spoken it in years. At least I don't think I have. I really wanted to sleep, but I knew not to let my guard down while Griswold was around. Also, Nesta kinda gives me the creeps. Seemingly right on cue, as things started to get peaceful, Griswold called out, announced to everyone that he is going to sleep in a tree. He pulled out 2 hand axes and dug them into a tree behind him and started climbing quickly. While he was doing a good job, there were no branches, at least 60 feet up. So, I decided to go ahead and watch. I'm going to enjoy the fall. Somehow, he made it to a branch, pulled himself up, and laid on its stomach first. Unfortunately, it was a thick branch capable of holding him up. A few moments later, V walked up to us, just in time for us to see a wagon coming to rest a distance away, pulling off the main path. Several men and women climbed out and brought us sheets and well-carved staves. When they started hammering stakes into the ground, I realized that they were setting up tents for us. It didn't take long for them to finish and make their way back to the wagon. I am unsure why we thought it was safer to camp out here than in the city. Hopefully any threats in the night will be deterred by our numbers. Discussions started on who should keep watch in what order. Griswold was already snoring up in his tree, so he was obviously out of the rotation. V and Noctis were also outside the conversation, but still at the campfire. V had handed him a vial, and he held an empty bottle in the other hand. He closed his eyes to concentrate. The empty bottle appeared to be filling with the same fluid that was in the vial, but then shattered. V had asked, "When you do it, it seems not to do what you thought it would do." And Noctis replied, "Well, I'm not too experienced, so sometimes it blows up early." Both Seiji and Nesta began to chuckle with amusement. Noctis continued to explain that the more you do it, the more familiar you become with the object. Nesta managed to choke back her laughter and advised that, like all things, it just takes practice. Seiji joined in with a voice too young to know of such things and asked, "Well, is it true that if you don't use it, you lose it?" Noctis, apparently oblivious to the joke, answered, "Why, yes. The substance only lasts an hour." Nesta said in a serious tone that she heard if it lasts for more than 4 hours, you should consult a cleric. I admit, as juvenile as the humor was, that one got me to laugh. Listening to them speak further, it seems like Noctis understands poisons, and V also has an interest in them. He had dealings with a group called the Obsidian Eye, which sparked his interest in poisons. I missed the details on how that happened. Nothing distracted me, I just didn't care. In fact, I hardly noticed when they had gotten up to walk a distance away. Maybe an impromptu date? Most likely they had a secret to discuss. Truth isn't exactly overflowing in this group. Seiji kept poking a stick at the fire like a child. Makes sense given how young he is. Nesta, however, kept scanning the woods intently, her attention focused like she heard something. "Nesta, what do you see?" She coolly responded that someone is out there, keeping an eye on us, but they're casual about it. They just finished eating and were bedding down for the night. "Well, are they a threat?" Her eyes turned to me, an eyebrow raised. "I worry not the wolf at the wall, but rather the one in sheep's wool." It took a few seconds to realize that she's watching me closely for a reaction. Was this a warning or accusation? Does she know something? If so, why isn't she... The three of us turned to see Griswold, face down in a body-shaped crater. He didn't even bounce. Seiji and Nesta looked at him with concern and shock. Me? What did I do? I laughed. I laughed so hard I thought my ribs would crack. I pushed Seiji out of the way so I could lay down, hoped to relieve some of the pain from my laughing fit. Griswold sat up, his eyes misty and floating. He stood and then slumped against a tree. He slid to the ground, already asleep again, or passed out, or unconscious. It didn't matter to me. Once I finally stopped giggling, I was able to sit at the fire again. Taking a few deep breaths, I was able to get clarity again. I was in a forest, surrounded by people I didn't know, being watched by something out in the woods. There was nothing safe about this situation. I guess in the morning, we will see how much I can trust this group. And that is the end of episode 3. Once again, thank you very much for taking the time to listen to the story. I hope you enjoyed it. If you enjoyed it and you would like to know when the next one comes out, by all means, turn on that notification so you know when it's out. Again, thank you very much for taking the time to listen, and you have a great day.